session of Irish History from the Hedgerow at the Irish Roots Cafe, produced by IrishRoots.com with Peter Riley Adams and Michael O'Laughlin. Find a spot on the warm, sunny side of the hedgerow now. Today's session is about to begin. They were rough, unpolished men, brilliant scholars, teaching by the side of the road, in small rooms, in nooks and crannies, wherever and whenever possible. Such men as these, they were the teachers of the hedge.
In our last discussion, we were making a great reference to the famine in Gorta Mór, the Great Hunger, and how many people then were forced, for various reasons, famine being only one, to leave Ireland, thus causing a great wave of emigration. But if we go back a little historically, and we look at other families in other times, there are many people who have many, many generations between them and Mother Ireland. And we know that even in the colonial period, in the 17th century, many people were coming from Ireland, but they were more of the Scotch-Irish Protestants. And they were leaving because of some other economic hardships that were in Ireland. Yes, later on came the hunger, and then you had a great number of Catholics who left. But the Irish, and yes, Scot-Irish, had come from Ulster and were here in the Americas. Originally, many of them went to Canada. Others, then, of course, came here to the United States before it even was the United States, when it was still part of the colonies. And when we look back in American history, we find names such as Jackson and Buchanan and Crockett. They were all Irish people, their families having already immigrated from Ireland.
Well, that's right. And you know, the first Presbyterian church in Pennsylvania was established in 1692. And although immigration was slight prior to, say, 1717, after that it became a little more hospitable. And like you said, it was the Ulster Scots, the Ulster Presbyterians, who were really known for coming over in the 1700s and doing their battle then. That's when they became famous. And, of course, the regular Irish, their century was the 19th century. Sure,
and the thing is that when people think who came over, was it those who were suffering from the famine or other things? There was a great mix from religion and social class that came, and Pennsylvania, Virginia, Tennessee. In fact, from a cultural note, if you look at some of the dancing that is done in Virginia, West Virginia, especially a dance known as clogging, that all has its origin in Irish step dancing. And the music. Listen to some of the music that is coming out of the South at those particular time, a lot with an Irish feel or an Irish lilt. Now, of course, also in immigration, one of the things that people don't realize because of the problems that there was between Ireland and England, a majority of immigrants for an awful long time, especially we'd say between 1800 and 1921 rather, went to England. But because England and Ireland in those years were really considered, after the Great Union of 1801, it was the same country. So immigration isn't necessarily seen by the British records as immigration. It was merely people moving from place to place in the populace.
Well, and you know, if you take a look at the figures for 1841, there were 419,000 Irish born in Great Britain at that time, and just 10 years later, as the famine was subsiding, there was 733,000 in England, and that was 3% of the English population. And although the numbers in Scotland were less, the percentage was bigger because there was 7% of the Scottish population was Irish born as well.
I'm saying that they say also that they probably missed at least 1 million Irish-born people in some of that because they weren't sure who was coming in terms with knowing some of those records.
You know, there's a different story. They say the Irish did not assimilate as well in Britain as they did in America, for example, and I guess that's understandable. They had more freedom in America, and they didn't have the history with the British government that was in the background at all times.
Well, and of course, they would still be under the same British laws that were imposed on Ireland in England because of who they were. Having been in London myself, I remember going to a particular Irish neighborhood and was rather amazed, of course, being an American born and seeing Irish in America, but being in England and being in an Irish neighborhood where people were all from Ireland and all singing their Irish songs and doing their Irish dances in the middle of London. So they were there, but as you're right, they weren't assimilating as they did into our population here in the United States.
Well, yes, it was like a subculture, really, and now you see a little bit. You jump into modern times and you see a lot of that sort of disappearing. You've got standardized pubs that have come in that are more international in nature, international in flavor, and you'll see religion starting to play a little bit lesser role, according to some people I've talked to over there. What have you seen on that, Peter?
In religion?
Yes.
Much less role. I've always had a theory. When they said, well, if everything gets to be very peaceful between Ireland and England, and for instance, with the Good Friday agreements and the decisions that were made from Downing Street and from Dublin and from Belfast, things became very peaceful. And right now they really are. Well, it's kind of hard when you take a good old enemy away from the Irish. They have to then maybe find another, or find some other thing to reject. And I think that's actually happening with the church. There's an awful growth of secularism in Ireland. Church attendance is down terribly. The young people are not going. And Anglican churches have closed. They're just not there. Though a strange thing has happened in England, the population in England is becoming more Roman Catholic than Anglican. But the reason they say for that is because of new immigrants coming from Eastern Europe and even from Africa who are being a part of the Catholic Church rather than the Anglican Church. But religion is having a much less significant role. And you can see that even in political issues. If you go back and remember that Eamon de Valera, when he was Taoiseach and then President of Ireland, he would ask the bishops what their opinion was on legislation and rules and laws. And if they disagreed, De Valera wouldn't push it. He wanted to make sure that the church was the part. I remember years ago being at a city council meeting in the County Cork, and it was opened with the Our Father and the Hail Mary, the city council meetings. So now it doesn't occur. Religion has a much less influence than it did before.
Well, yes, and I saw they were looking at the number of, currently the number of Irish born in Australia, and I can't remember if those were people that had become citizens or they were just visitors, but 25%, somewhere around 25% number were the number of people who declared no religion whatsoever. So that's a vast change from the history. We don't know if it's a temporary thing, but at least the younger folks, it looks like on their declaration, aren't even claiming a religion, which is a big switch from previous centuries.
Well, and also there was the stereotype. And oftentimes people thought if you're Irish, therefore you're Catholic. Well, there is a great growth of Quakers in Ireland, and also the Assembly of God and Jehovah Witnesses. Right near Killarney, there's a brand new Jehovah Witness building. And, of course, they're also bringing in mosques, unheard of in the last 25 years.
Well, that's
so
right.
There's a great immigration into Ireland, which is causing some of this.
That's right. And since we're talking a little bit about religion, there were several Jewish houses of worship there, too, and they've started closing those down. There were a couple in Dublin, I think it was. I forget the numbers, but the numbers of the practicing Jewish are way down in Ireland, for one thing. And then several years ago, gosh, it must have been 20 years ago, 20 or 30 on a trip, I took over a missionary really for the Baptist church, sort of on a little mission. And I inquired at that time I didn't know, that there were many Baptists there. And she said, no, there were just a handful. So people have been trying to convert the island for a long time, and that's just two more comments, one on Baptist and one on the Jewish.
Well, sure. Religion, like I said, it's declining in countries who have become wealthy. And remember, in the last 10 years, the Celtic tiger, people have a tendency when they are poor and impoverished and have real concerns about what's going to be in the future, they become a little more religious. When you're very comfortable and things are going so well, you tend to forget a little bit about religion. On the Jewish side, remember, President Herzog of Israel was born in Dublin. So there was a great Jewish presence. But, of course, as in any place and in all of Europe, how there was, and with the creation of the State of Israel, which was created just a year before the Republic of Ireland was declared, there are people who would then move to Israel because of their religion.
Well, that's right. And if we take a look at it, of course, we talked about those that early period in the 1700s when the Scots-Irish came over. They were, of course, Presbyterian mainly, and they faced up to some religious persecution in Ireland after coming from Scotland to Ireland, and then they came to America. And when they landed on America, they didn't let them settle in all those nice little cities so much. They sort of got forced onto the Appalachian frontier and into places where they did battle with the Indians to protect the rest of civilization. And that was a religious distinction between the two kinds of Irish coming over at the time. And the term Scotch-Irish, they say, was actually born in America to describe those Ulster Presbyterians that came over in the 1700s.
Well, it's like people always think of Boston as a very great Catholic city. The truth of it is it wasn't at all. It was a great Protestant city. And the Irish, of course, because of the immigration, came in and slowly overturned that with a growth in the Irish Catholic population. Then Boston became more Irish. But there was a great prejudice against Catholics in many of the major cities. In New York, the immigrants changed the religious scope of things. America, the United States, was basically a Protestant country. There was one signer, John Carroll, for the Declaration of Independence. He was Catholic, and his cousin was Archbishop of Baltimore, but only one. All the others are Protestant. And so the real religious idea was to be Protestant against, in a sense, the hierarchy or the dominance of Rome.
Well, now, what about some of the other countries that the Irish might have settled in? We could just make some brief mentions because you can do a show on each country, and we might do that later. I think that would be a good idea here at the Hedge School. In Canada, they first came in, and I guess that would have been the Scots-Irish, mainly in Newfoundland. They introduced the potato there in the 1750s, and that's one more tie with the Irish and the potatoes. And then they settled on Prince Edward Island. And South Africa, you don't think much about that, but there were Irish regiments seated in South Africa in the 19th century, and there was a stream of immigrants at the Cape. And, of course, way later on in the 19th century, there was the discovery of the gold mines. And that brought a lot of Irish in, not just from Ireland. I mean, relatively speaking, there was never a mass migration. But not only did Irishmen come from Ireland, but Irishmen and Irish Americans came in to South Africa to help with the gold mines then. And a lot of them are described here and in South America, too, as engineers. Now, I haven't really researched what that engineering title meant, but you sure find it on them a lot of times. Peter, what do you think about the rest of the diaspora of the Irish?
Well, one of the things, there's a common thread. And if we look at just the ones you mentioned, if we look at Canada, if we look at England, as I mentioned, where there's a great migration to, you look at Australia, you look at South Africa, all of those were British colonies. So there's oddly enough, as much as the Irish were trying to go away, they were actually moving with the same kind of rule. But there was easier passage to a country which was in the empire, was much easier. And there was, of course, rebellion starting in all of them. The only one we don't seem to have had a great rebellion in is Canada, and the ones who had any rebellion there were the French. But if you go to South Africa, we know what's happened there. The English, of course, and then the Boer Wars. When they were dealing with the Afrikaners or the Dutch,
And the Irish fought on both sides.
yeah, well,
That's normal.
You said I want to be with the winner, whoever that might turn out to be. But you'll find out I'll be with the winner. But they did follow that one strain. All of the places, the majority of the places, not all, of course, but the majority that we're talking about right now were places that were already a part of the empire. An interesting one that should be going on, and I think we can do a whole show on that one, is the Irish in Latin America. Bernardo O'Higgins. Leaders in the wars and in the risings of the people for independence in all those countries. And the Irish were a part of that.
That's right. And O'Higgins, he was known as the father of some of those revolutions down there, and he was well known in Chile and Peru. And to give him a date, he passed away in 1842. But the very first English horse race in South America, that was in 1826. You know what the name of that horse was? Shamrock. Now, I don't know if that tells you something about luck. And the first daily paper that appeared in English in South America was founded by Irishman Michael Mulhall. So you can make a list of pages of those things, and I'm sure you've seen it a lot in your reading.
Absolutely. You go all over, and you'll discover the Irish have been involved, and they were entrepreneurs in a sense. They were willing to try anything. And when you talk about newspapers and literature, they were champions at it, what they were able to do with language, and they were always very interested in learning. And so they took those traits with them. The one thing they say, I remember listening to a great poet from Listowel in County Kerry, the playwright, who would say that the Irish had this in them. He almost called it like a tale. You can't tell. They said the Irish had tails. He said, well, we did. The trait within us was that we carried the ability to do good things no matter where we went.
Yes, that's quite true. And that newspaper heritage and the need to communicate with the rest of the folks, that was really a strong thing in America all the way, not just from the coastline where they settled, but all the way into the heart of America, and all the way out into California. The number of papers that were established by Irishmen was really remarkable.
When you were mentioning the notion of engineers, when we look in the United States, when we look at Canada, we look at Australia, South Africa, and look at the growth of railroads, tunnels, the Irish were right involved. There's an interesting story that in the United States, when the Irish were working at building some of the railroads and working some of the things in the South, some of the industrialists wanted to use some of the slaves that were there. And the slave owners, of course, we're talking pre-Civil War, said, no, we can't use the slaves. They're too valuable. They're worth something. Use the Irish. They're just expendable. And so when it comes to engineers, the Irish, hard work. And remember, we were an agrarian society, coming from the farms, not really knowing much about cities, but yet the Brooklyn Bridge in New York, built by Irishmen. The New York subway system, the tunnels dug by Irishmen. The tunnels under the Hudson River, dug by Irishmen. And are not completely, obviously, there were other nationalities involved, but you'll find a great presence of the Irish. The railroad across the United States. Go to San Francisco, go to the East, even to California. And, of course, they went also in search of gold in the gold rush of 1847. Rushing out there, searching for something better. But the engineer thing, I think, also came about. An engineer, in today's world, it's a nice way of saying, like a janitor is no longer a janitor. They're an enginer.
That's right. He might have just been the head worker.
That's right. So it's an engineer without not saying something about engineers in terms of mechanical engineering and builders, architects. The engineer is someone who was doing the task. And the Irish certainly found themselves doing the task of doing the hard labor, which did, in fact, help build not only this country, but did in Australia and in in Canada also, and in South Africa.
Well, and you said that you mentioned that how the Irish moved to the cities. A lot of people are perplexed when they write histories. They'll say, well, even though Ireland was a rural country, when they came to America, they flocked to the cities, and they're a little puzzled. But you know what? They said, well, of course, they were betrayed by the famine. The land might have betrayed them that way. But they also didn't have much choice whether to be a rural or not. That's just the way it was. Don't you think that's true?
Oh, absolutely. They came, and when they came, and I know the case, for instance, when some of my family came in, we came in many, many different times, yet all coming from Ireland, even up to just a generation before me, that they came and found someone who was related to them before who happened to live in the city. So the new Irishman came and went to someone who was an established Irishman. And there were a great number of letters written back and forth. This was a great form of communication. And those letters were sent back to Ireland. And when it became easier to get letters back and forth, they would send money. And then those people would then take the money to pay for the passage to come to the United States. But they lived in the cities. And it wasn't until later in jobs, I know some people even where we live here, that they came in transportation. They came to be bus drivers, and they came to work in the railroad, or they came to work in the packing houses. Because those things, they were farmers, so they did know cattle, and they did know how to deal with those kinds of things. And so they moved from the cities, but it was later. Originally, they came into the cities. Then they actually ran into some of the same problems in the cities because of disease, because of the thing, and they couldn't survive there. And then they decided to move out, and with land grants that were given by the government to help populate the West, and maybe even to help move the Indians along.
Those of us that have traced their families back through the paperwork in America, and it'll work for other countries too, but there have been volumes printed of the ads that were put in the newspapers, like the Boston Pilot and Freeman's Journal, New York and Boston papers, other papers. They'll just be page after page, and I can think of at least 7 or 8 full-size volumes that just have certain years where it says, hey, I'm looking for John O'Reilly, who came over 2 years ago. I can't find him. He's my uncle. Please let me know. Just page after page of that, so they could keep in touch with each other as they came over into the cities, and it just wasn't the same out in the country.
No, it wasn't. But when you think about these people who took the risk of getting on a ship and traveling. And in the beginning, it took weeks and weeks to get across the ocean. As time went on, the ships got better. It took less. Actually, it started to come to about 10 days. But think about the people, the adventurous spirit of those who said they were going to go find a new life. They came over. They found in the cities, but they thought, well, this still isn't what I want. Yet look at all that land out there. What a vast country. And, from American history, the notion of the manifest destiny that we would have from coast to coast, from sea to shining sea. And so the Irish took that up, and they started going across, and they were part of the pioneers, part of those who continued to make America America, and went out to every state and every possibility.
Well, that's right. And Joseph Murphy, he was a big-time wagon builder, built over 100,000 wagons that settled the American frontier along the Oregon and the California Trail, and he did that out of St. Louis. And, you mentioned that trip. Australia took even longer. It was months to go to Australia.
It still takes time to get to Australia.
That's exactly right. It took a lot longer. And if you were paying your own way, you had to pay that. So it seems that people were a little better off that went to Australia as a free person. And a lot of people say, well, didn't all the convicts go there? Well, some were declared convicts, but you know what? Over 300,000 Irish free settlers arrived in Australia between 1840 and 1914. So don't forget that part of the mix either.
Absolutely. And another thing that kept people in the cities and that helped them when they were in the cities before they then left to find new lands was the Catholic Church. So many of them, especially after the hunger, who left, they were Catholics. They came, and where did they go? They went, of course, to church, and of course then in the Irish community, and the priest helped them, and they also were able to show them where else to go, where to find other fortune. And the church was everywhere and also was expanding. From that time, the Catholic Church wasn't as expensive then because of the new lands, and they went out to help as missionaries also and to spread the faith.
And in some of those rural areas in America, you were lucky to have one circuit rider come by of a certain religion. So every once in a while, you're going to find some folks who are obviously came from Ireland, from the south of Ireland, and they were Catholics when they left the country. But there was no Catholic Church. There was no preacher of their denomination on hand. So they ended up, after a couple of generations with no other religion, they'd go to the local church no matter what it was, and you're going to find a change in religion. Now, this isn't in a lot of cases, but it sure is in some, because out there on the frontier, the Catholic Church, it took a little while for them to get out there in some cases.
Oh, sure it did. But the one thing that they wanted to carry, maybe they didn't, and they didn't have the priests, and they didn't have that, the churches available, but they still had the desire to worship God, and that was a part of the Irish soul. We talked about religion and having its impact, and then what happened after they came here. But a fascinating thing is, if you look at especially the period after the Great Hunger, the majority of people who were emigrating left from the old Queenstown. In fact, that in those days it was Queenstown. But today it's Cobh, C-O-B-H. And in Cobh, which is a very hilly port in the southern part, a little further east of city of Cork, in County Cork, the cathedral is very close to the harbor, and it's the Cathedral of St. Colman. It's also known as the Cathedral of the Immigrants. It's a magnificent cathedral, and it sits up on this hill. And as you go out, and I have been on a tugboat going out into the harbor, and the further you go out in the harbor, of course, the visual of the town and things becomes less and less, but that church dominates the line. And the last thing you see the further you go out is the steeple and the cross. And there's an old story that I was told in Cobh that when immigrants were leaving, they had very little. They would attend Mass before they went, never knowing if they would ever be able to go to Mass again, or ever find a church again, or ever know what was to happen to them. And they might leave a penny or a pence behind. Well, at the time, the Monsignor and the Bishop, they saved so many of those and built this spire and helped the church going, but the spire then became a symbol that the immigrant could always look, and before they left, the last thing they'd see would be the cross on top of the steeple. And it's that symbol of the cross that so many of them brought with them when they arrived here in the New World.
Boy, when we've covered a lot of territory today, Peter, and that's what the Hedge School is all about. And I think I should remind our listeners that we're going to have separate shows on a lot of these topics we covered today, because we wanted to give a bigger picture at first, and we're going to talk about with separate shows on the Irish in Australia and the Irish in South America and South Africa, and of course Canada and the story of Groseal and those areas. So that's all coming down the road, but we wanted to give you a little introduction here, and we're sure glad you're joining us, and we're just starting to get the final nails put into this Hedge School and getting our locations down. I don't know if we're going to pick out a barn or a little gully or what to do some of our classes in, but Peter's sure been doing a good job, and I just wanted to say welcome to everybody, and thanks for joining us. Peter, I'll leave it to you to sign off.
All right, Michael, thanks very much. We are looking forward to presenting some of these topics and ideas, and we just want to keep the hedge growing.
So ends this chapter of Irish History from the Hedgerow. The entire series is available at www.irishroots.com. We have broadcast series on genealogy, song, local history, as well as original publications for every county in Ireland. The Hedge School in Ireland was totally reliant upon the local community to survive, just as we are here today in our modern-day Hedge School. If you believe in what we are doing for your community, please do send us your support. You can sponsor a session of Irish Hedgerow history for as little as $100 and become a recognized scholar of the hedge. You will also receive a pass or letter of introduction from the instructors here at the school, as was the custom of the hedgerow. So keep the hedge growing with your donation, subscription, or membership. Thank you. We have been available for speaking engagements, exhibits, tours, and educational events since 1984. You can reach us at the Irish Roots Cafe on Twitter and Facebook, and on our homepage at www.irishroots.com.